about how we incorporate all of these things into protecting the people that you care about. Now, one of the things that I do, and I try to explain this to people, it's a little bit counterintuitive for many people in terms of, well, how are you going to spend your time? How are you going to spend your resources? You're not going to benefit yourself by listening to this per se, benefit yourself in any worldly way, right? All of what we're going to be talking about is what happens in a world where where you're probably not, well, if we're talking about inheritance specifically, we're talking about a world in which you are not going to be here, and the circumstances of the people that you're going to leave behind, you are completely ignorant. This is ilmul ghaib, right? And so I want to talk about that, and I'll tell you a little bit. I'll start with a story, and a lot of the times the best way to explain things is by telling you a story. Think of a man named Abdullah. Abdullah marries a woman named Bilqis. Now, Abdullah and Bilqis are very happy. It's a wonderful marriage, and they have two beautiful children, Bilal and Haritha. Now, unfortunately, one person dies. Bilqis passes away. Now, does anybody have any idea what Abdullah is very likely to do, probably within the next 10 to 18 months? Yeah, okay. Get married. That's a good option. In fact, that's extremely likely. We actually have an adage in estate planning: women mourn, men replace. It's just like that. We normally will see men. Yeah, that's the adage. It's probably unfair, but it's kind of true. Women will tend to not get remarried very quickly a lot of the times when they've been widowed. Sometimes they do, but more often men will very, very quickly try to get remarried. It's just the way things tend to work out. It's not always that way, and there's nothing that I can't generalize that this is always going to happen. But from what I've seen in my practice dealing with Muslims, non-Muslims for several years, it's that when there's a death in a married couple, and then the death is of the woman, the man is usually going to get remarried very quickly. Now, let's continue on with this story. Bilqis dies, right? Abdullah marries Sumayya. Sumayya has some children of her own, and they have what you refer to as a blended family. 2 years later, Abdullah passes away. And so the question I have for you here is, what happens to the wealth that Abdullah and Bilqis accumulated? Does it go to Bilal and Haritha, or does it go to somebody else? Does anybody know the answer to that? Right, so do they have a prenuptial agreement? Well, normally people don't arrange for things in advance. Normally that's not what happens. Most of the time, what people do is that they own their property jointly, joint tenants with right of survivorship, or they just, or there's a cultural tendency here in the United States to give everything to the surviving spouse. That's just what tends to happen. Normally, what happens in marriages is that the surviving spouse, when they're the surviving spouse, especially if the surviving spouse is the man, they're usually going to go along with whatever the wife wants to do. The new wife wants to do, and the new wife normally wants to have some sort of economic security, and they're going to want to get the best deal possible out of this arrangement. That doesn't always happen. Of course, there is such a thing as prenuptial agreements. There are such things as estate plans. There are things that you can do, but for the most part, people are not going to do these sorts of things. First of all, the man is generally in a very big hurry to get remarried, and he's usually going to go with whatever terms are available to him. One of the most important pieces of advice, Jazakallah khair for the water, by the way. One of the most important pieces of advice that I could ever give when it comes to estate planning is not get a lawyer, get a will, get a living trust. I mean, these are all wonderful things and you should do them, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing that you should do is marry wisely. Marry wisely. So, wow, Jazakallah khair. I'm thirsty today. So, I actually had one case not too long ago, a few years ago, where there was this one man. Man was incredibly successful. He was this industrialist. He was this inventor. He had lots of employees, private jets, did very, very well for himself. And he had a wife. He had grown-up children. And one day his wife passed away. And he was of course distraught, as men tend to be. And then he got a wrong number call. Somebody called him. It was a wrong number call. And he just kept on talking to this person. And then he ended up marrying her. And he stayed married to her for over 20 years until he actually died. During that time, though, he became significantly poor, became much more isolated from his adult children. And after he died, I got the case after he died. It turned out, and apparently the man had absolutely no idea of any of this, but the woman that he married was a convicted felon. She was a thief, and she systematically stole millions of dollars from him on her behalf and for her family members. And her whole family was basically a family of grifters. There are some remarkable things that took place during this time, but in the end, I mean, it's just that people are not incredibly careful when it comes to making decisions with regard to marriage. But even so, one of the stories that's most commonly told in the scenario that I just mentioned is Cinderella. Cinderella is a story that starts out with her having two parents, then one parent who gets remarried, then there's this evil, wicked stepmother and wicked stepsisters, and her own wealth is then weaponized against her. And this particular story of an orphan that is being mistreated in this way, this Cinderella story, has actually been studied by literary scholars for many years, and they've found that this particular story has been around in every single culture, in every single period of history through all recorded time. So if you go back to ancient Chinese history, you go back to Vietnamese history, you go back to any culture that has recorded language and that has recorded stories of some sort or of another, you're going to find this particular motif where orphans tend to be oppressed. And so that's where it brings us to this notion of oppression of orphans and the concept that is pretty well known in the Quran. That the Quran actually specifies that people who eat the wealth of orphans will have nothing but fire in their bellies, and they will be burned into a blaze. And that's in the Quran, and that's in Surah Nisa in verse 10. And immediately after that, we have Yusikumullahu fi awladikum, which is concerning the inheritance of your children. And then we have a series of inheritance rules. It's known as the Mawarithaya, and it specifies in fractional form what inheritance specific people in your family are supposed to receive. And so this particular system of inheritance is one of the best developed and most comprehensive systems of inheritance that exists in humanity. And one of the more important things about it is that it's fard for all Muslims to follow these rules of inheritance. Another thing about it is that it's one of those things that gets lost to the Muslim Ummah. It's an area of the Sharia that has largely fallen into darkness. And so one of the more important things that we need to do here today, and this is a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that learn about the faraid and teach it to the people. And so we need to make sure that the knowledge of inheritance is something that continues on from generation to generation, not just merely the fact that you're doing inheritance right, which is of course important, but the fact that you're doing it a particular way is also itself important. Because what is our system here in the United States? Our system here in the United States is something called free alienation of property. What does free alienation of property mean? It means it's my money, my money, my money. I can do with it as I please. Now, there are some caveats to this, and different states have different rules, but generally speaking, if you want to give your money away to one child, one wife, one husband, if you want to treat people differently, if you want to treat people the same, if you don't want to give anything to anybody, you can do that. If you want to take all of your money and burn it in front of a group of orphans, you can probably do that. What did we have with Leona Helmsley? Leona Helmsley was known as the Queen of Mean in New York. She owned the Empire State Building. She decided that she wanted to give $5.3 billion for the benefit of dogs. And then she had like this one dog that she gave several $1 million to, a dog named Trouble. I think it was like $6 million. And then she also decided that she wanted to build this beautiful mausoleum for herself with a mural of the New York City skyline. And it was a very nice, very expensive mausoleum, but because she knew that she didn't really like people and people didn't really like her, she wanted people to actually visit this mausoleum. So she had some beneficiaries, some she just cut off completely, but some beneficiaries that she actually did want to give something to. She said that if you need to come to the mausoleum once a year and you need to sign a guest book. And if you don't sign the guest book that particular year, you don't get anything that particular year. So she literally bought the loyalty of people to come in and sign her guest book. Now what happens in Islam? Islam is a little bit different, right? We can't do whatever it is that we want with our money, right? We intuitively know that it's not our money, right? Lillahi ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard. Everything in the heavens and the earth and all that it contains belongs to Allah. Whereas under the law, if you want to take your money, you want to gamble it, right? You can gamble it. If you don't want to give any money to charity, you don't want to give any money to the poor, you don't have to. Nobody's making you, right? But what do we know about in Islam? Yeah, of course. You need to make sure and stay away from the haram, and you need to give money in charity, and after you die, your dead hand can't control other people's lives, right? Allah has determined how inheritance is supposed to be distributed and in what manner it's supposed to be distributed. Why? Well, because this is actually one of the more fundamental things about Islamic society. What is it that we have right now in the United States? We go to a place called probate court. Has anybody ever heard of probate court? A few of you? Well, I actually get to go to probate court quite often in my particular profession. And what probate court is that you have a lot of people who are passing away, right? A lot of people are passing away, and a lot of these people have money. And a lot of these people who are passing away also have children. And what do the children do? Well, they sue each other over inheritance money. And they do it every single day on a regular basis. So it's often brother against brother, sister against sister. And we have this fundamental breakdown in society that occurs because people are saying, look, you manipulated dad, or you did this, or this happened, and this horrible story occurred, and now I'm being treated unfairly, and I don't like it, and so I'm suing. And that's how it works, right? Because we have this breakdown in society. We don't have a lot of loyalty in the American family. But what happens when we do it based on the Islamic rules of inheritance? What happens when we do it based on the Islamic rules of inheritance? There is nobody to be upset with. Because It is what it is. The person who passed away, the brother of the person who passed away, the son of the person who passed away, had nothing to do with how inheritance is supposed to be distributed, right? There was no manipulation. What happened? It's in the Quran. It's in the Quran. This person was a believing Muslim. He did what Allah ordered him to do, and there is nothing to be upset about. There is nobody to be angry with. I actually was in court a few years ago. I was in court in Los Angeles, and I was in line for my own case. This had nothing to do with my own case. Probate court is public. Anybody can go to court and actually see all the drama, just like what happens in criminal defense or what happens in family court. You can just go and sit there, and if you if your cable TV's on the fritz, you can just go there and check it out and see what's going on over there. So I was there on my own case, but I was in line and I was waiting, and there was this one case where there was about 7 or 8 lawyers arguing over a case, and they wanted to argue, and it was taking about 15 minutes, and the argument was whether or not to continue the hearing for another week for some paperwork or something. But as I was listening to this case, it actually occurred to me that I knew this person who passed away, and I knew the family. The case was worth several hundred millions of dollars, and it's actually one of the most prominent Muslim families in the whole Los Angeles area. And then it occurred, and I knew them well enough to know that this was a really tight-knit, close family. And then what happened was, after this person died, everybody started to scatter, everybody started suing everybody else, and relationships have been frayed. And this is several years ago. To this day, relationships continue to be frayed. I see this frequently with various families that I see. Well, if there's a situation where there are 2 brothers who are now in their 70s and haven't spoken to each other for over 20 years, why? It's usually going to be because of some inheritance thing. I talked to that particular case. I actually had some clients in the lower rungs of that family. And I talked to one of them and I asked, well, what was going on? And his answer was, you know what happened was that they didn't follow the Islamic rules of inheritance. If they followed Islam, if they followed what was in the Quran, none of this would have happened. And so it's critical to make sure that we follow the Islamic rules of inheritance. And so California law allows you to do that because why? We have free alienation of property. By the way, I'm talking right now, and I know that some people are engaged, and maybe some of you have questions or what have you. If you have a question, because as I understand this is set up, my talking here is, I'm like standing between you and your dinner. And so I want to make sure and make this as efficient as possible. If you have a question that pertains to what it is that I talked about, like say for example, I'm talking too fast, or I made a point that wasn't clear, or I jumbled something, or you want to ask something that pertains to that particular topic, go ahead and ask that question. It's okay. You might be doing the person sitting next to you or behind you a favor. If it's something like on a different topic, or if it has something to do with your own personal situation, leave that for later on. You can ask me. I'll be here after the program, and you can ask me questions then. Okay, so moving on. When we talk about the California system, you can do whatever it is that you want. It's just that for the most part, and there are going to be some issues that people have with Islamic inheritance. I think intuitively most people know a little bit about Islamic inheritance, even if they don't know a lot of the rules. What's one rule about Islamic inheritance that you think everybody knows? Anybody knows what that rule is? Right. Okay, so I guess one person knew that. I thought everybody knew that, but no. So basically what happens is that it's daughters get 1 share for every 2 shares that the son gets. I'm going to explain that a little bit further, but that's actually one thing that a lot of people do know. It's not some generalized rule that girls get half of what boys get. That's actually not, or women get less than men in all instances. That's not the rule. But I'll actually describe how the inheritance system works in a broad sense. Inheritance rules can become quite complex. Basically what happens is first you need to actually decide what your property is, what it is that you own. And I'm going to discuss what it is that you own a little bit further, because it's actually not that obvious, especially if you're a married person. What it is that you own is not going to necessarily be intuitive. But first of all, you need to actually make sure that you are your own economic unit, right? You, as an individual human person, have your own stuff, and your husband, your wife, has his or her own stuff. It's not going to be all our stuff. Even if it's something that is a percentage or something along those lines, that's fine, as long as you can define what it is that you own. Now, what makes inheritance somewhat different in the Islamic tradition is that parents actually inherit, and they inherit quite a bit. Parents inherit 1/6, though the father inherits 1/6, and the mother inherits 1/6. So if you have parents, then they inherit. Now, in the absence of parents, if they're grandparents from that line, then they may also inherit in the absence of parents. Spouses inherit. Spouses either inherit 1/8 or 1/4, depending on whether they're children. That's for the wife. Or the husband will get 1/2 or 1/4, depending on whether or not there are children. Now the balance goes to the children, with 2 shares for the boy for every 1 share for the girl. That's a general rule when it comes to inheritance. Now, in certain instances, there might be siblings who might inherit. There might be other people like uncles and aunts and cousins and things like that. That could all happen. But for the most part, people have parents, people have a spouse, people have children, and so it's going to be fairly close. But there are going to be situations where we're going to have to go a little bit wider. Now, let's talk about community property. Does anybody know what community property is? Brother, what's your name? Muzaffar, what's community property? Fifty-50 of what? Okay, so that's pretty good, pretty close. Basically, what community property is that everything that you earn through your skill, labor, and effort while you are part of a community is community property. And so this brings us to something that is often referred to as a partnership theory of marriage. Now, partnership theory of marriage is one way of looking at marriage. It is not necessarily the only way of looking at marriage. So a lot of people will, just because of our culture in California, people will intuitively think that whatever they bring, and this is actually supported by the default rule in California, if you're an engineer, you go and get a salary as an engineer, 50% of it belongs to you, 50% of it belongs to your spouse. You accumulate that over the years, you get a house, you get stocks, you get all sorts of stuff. You build a business, 50% of it belongs to each spouse. Whether you actually went in to the office and clocked in or not is irrelevant. As long as you are part of that community, you get 50-50. Now, there are certain assets that are going to be excluded. Of course, anything that you did not earn while you are in the community, anything that you did not earn through your skill, labor, and effort while you were part of the community. So that includes anything that you had before marriage, anything that was given to you as a gift, any inheritance. Those sorts of things are not going to be community property. Those things are going to be separate property unless the spouses agree that it's all community property. Now, marriage is a creature of contract. A husband and wife can do what they want, for the most part, as between the two of them. So if there is a married couple that says to the husband and wife agree, look, your stuff is your stuff, my stuff is my stuff, we're going to have separate bank accounts, and we're just going to work things out that way. We're going to keep these separate responsibilities, but we're going to keep our stuff separate, but we'll be married and we'll be happy together that way. And there are actually a lot of married couples that do it exactly that way. That's a relatively common way of doing it. Now, in California, that's not a very common way of doing it, though it does happen. Nobody is forcing you to do community property. If you want to do separate property, you can do separate property. If you want to do some community, some separate, you can do that as well. In Islam, Islam does not regulate the type of agreement that husbands and wives make. Now, a lot of people will tell me that that this might be un-Islamic, or they might intuitively think this way. Because what did I say about what wives get as inheritance? They get 1/8, they get 1/4. And so what I'm talking about here is 50-50. 50% to the husband, 50% to the wife. How is that consistent? And the reason that is consistent is because when we're talking about community property, we are not talking about inheritance. We are talking about a financial arrangement made during lifetime. And so if a husband dies and a wife gets 50% as her share of community property, that is not inheritance. That 50% belongs to the wife whether her husband is dead or alive. That is her assets, right? You just have to divide it up. That was never, as long the moment the husband agreed to this whole community property arrangement, that's not the husband's money. And so it's not like he's giving you anything in inheritance for the 50%. That was already yours. Now from that other 50% that belonged to the deceased husband, we're killing off the husband in this example. So in the example of the deceased husband, 50% constitutes 100% of the deceased husband's assets, and then that is distributed 1/8, 1/6, 1/6, the balance to the children. That's what happens to those assets. And so it does not actually contradict the Islamic rules of inheritance. Another way of looking at it is if a husband, and somebody maybe can answer this question for me, if a husband wanted to give his wife a $100,000 Ferrari, is there anything in Islam that prevents him from doing that? No, not really. Unless he didn't actually have $100,000 and he robbed a bank, that wouldn't, he's not allowed to do that. So, but otherwise, yeah, he could of course give that type of a gift. Let's talk a little bit about protecting the surviving spouse. What's the biggest asset that people tend to have living in California? Any guesses? House. Okay. So what did I say? Inheritance for the surviving spouse is 1/8. And say somebody has a house. We'll go back to Abdullah and Bilqis. Say Abdullah and Bilqis, they have a house here in wonderful South Bay. It's worth $1.1 million, and they have $20,000 in the bank, right? That could totally happen. Actually, it happens a lot, right? They might have a house that's accumulated in value quite a bit. And then of course Abdullah dies. Well, what if his wife wanted to continue to live in that house? First of all, we know that she can't take the house. She can't take it all anyway, because a very big chunk of it belongs to other people. It belongs to children. And it might belong to the parents, or at least little portions of it. So she can sell off the house, take her portion, whatever that is, and that would be the end of it, right? But she'd still have to figure out how to live in the South Bay. And it's kind of expensive to live in the South Bay. And the other part of it is that you want to have some level of security for your wife, for your husband, right? You don't want to have a situation necessarily where if you die, you are instantly putting your wife in some level of economic insecurity. And so part of what we do when we plan is we want to make sure that there is a sense of, and this becomes important as we get older and older. We want to make sure that there's this sense of security and there's this sense of dignity, while at the same time not taking away or denying anybody the right to inheritance. And the question then becomes, how do we do that? So this gets me to a discussion of how we do estate planning in the first place. Because we do want to make sure that inheritance is distributed properly. We also want to avoid probate court, even if it's not as long as there's no litigation or anything, you want to be able to make sure administratively it's less expensive and that we're able to make sure everything is done consistently with the Islamic rules of inheritance. And so we typically plan, or the foundation of any plan is going to be something called a revocable living trust. Has anybody ever heard of a revocable living trust? Sister, what's your name? Amy, Sister Amy, what is that? That's an excellent answer. Yes, sister. You can change it any time, that's right. That's where the revocability comes in. And so a revocable living trust is a contract. It's a contract and it's a property management device. And what you're doing here is, in California, it's kind of a modern will equivalent. And a will is kind of a rule book or some sort of a statement that says, after I die, such and such things are supposed to happen. Now, a living trust will go a little bit further than that and not just specify after I die, such and such things are supposed to happen, but after I become incapacitated, meaning that if I'm not able to make decisions for myself anymore because you're just not, because your family has decided that you're not capable of making financial decisions, then somebody else will make those decisions for you. And so there are three parties to this contract. The first is a grantor, and the grantor is the person who creates this arrangement in the first place. So a grantor is the owner of the property, right? So say Abdullah and Bilqis, they decide to make a trust. They would be the grantors. Now, they're making a revocable living trust, so they're also going to be the trustees. So the grantor gives property to the trustees, and they're giving it for the benefit of the third group of people in this arrangement, and they're the entire reason this arrangement exists in the first place, and that's the beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries will also be Abdullah and Bilqis. They're going to be the grantors, they're going to be the trustees, they're going to be the beneficiaries, and so they're creating this trust, which is essentially an agreement by themselves, for the benefit of themselves. But what happens is after they die or they become incapacitated, there are successors. So there are successor trustees, people who are going to manage the property in the event that they cannot manage it themselves, either because of death or incapacity. Or after they die, they're going to be beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries are going to be those people who are entitled to inherit from them under the Islamic rules of inheritance. So they want to make sure that these that their values are incorporated into this trust. They will also want to make sure that there isn't any judicial supervision. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a will. A last will and testament is a typical way people will decide how assets are distributed after they pass away. The problems with it is that it's generally, especially if you're a property owner, if you have assets more than, say, $150,000, it's going to be subject to a process known as probate. Not only is it more expensive, but there is also a chance that any Islamic provisions that you have in it might be ignored by a judge, because a judge has the probate code, and they have their own system of rules that they need to adopt. When you create a trust, you are creating your own rules, and those rules can be different from what is in the probate code. So you are creating a contract, and so what we create is something called the law of the contract. If you create a contract between two individuals and you have all of the provisions for that contract, and those provisions are not against public policy in California, but they are different from what's in the civil code or what's in California law, your rules of the contract are going to be what controls. And so we are creating a separate set of rules for Islamic inheritance by doing it through a trust utilizing the rules of contract. Does everybody understand that? Okay. So let's go back to the issue of protecting the spouse, because one of the things that we do is design trusts for the purpose of protecting spouses in a particular way, or sometimes protecting children in particular ways as well. Of course, the Islamic rules of inheritance mandates the shares of inheritance, but the shares of inheritance doesn't necessarily mean cash. It doesn't necessarily mean a specific thing. So say you have a corporation. It could mean shares of the corporation, or LLC. It could mean various types of things, including beneficial interests in trusts. So if you create a trust and you have a trustee and you create an ability for the surviving spouse to continue to live in the house, while at the same time protecting the surviving spouse's Prop 13 rights in the house. Because if you have like a $1.2 million house or something in the South Bay that you purchased for $200,000 some years ago, what'll happen is that your property taxes are going to be fairly low, and you want to make sure that those property taxes continue to be fairly low. And part of your planning is going to incorporate that as well. The other thing that you might do is include a deed of trust, and you might include a separate trust that owns a note that benefits the other family members. You're also going to have the ability to give some inheritance. So if in the event that there's some cash available and one of the beneficiaries wants or needs the money, you need to have some ability to let them cash out as well. So you want to be able to facilitate family arrangements, family unity, and have a mechanism for making sure that the surviving spouse continues to maintain his or her dignity, while also being certain that inheritance is not being denied to anybody. Another thing that we need to also plan for is remarriage. Remarriage, particularly when it comes to families that have children, and especially families like older people who get remarried and they have adult children, there is probably no greater fitna on earth than that could be caused than that particular scenario. It often has some tragic consequences for family. First of all, older people do need to get remarried, but many times children will just think the person is a gold digger, or there's going to be some dynamics within some family politics that are going to be created as a result of that happening. And you want to be able to alleviate that situation by stating that, say the surviving spouse is the trustee of the trust, which often happens. The surviving spouse is the manager of the trust and managing assets that belong to all the other family members. Now, if that trustee decides to get remarried, we might say that because you got remarried, you can no longer be the trustee of the trust. We might also say, and this is also a possibility, that you could be the trustee of the trust if you get a prenuptial agreement that respects the rights of the Islamic heirs. What often happens with these remarriage situations is that there is an effort, there's this sort of dance that happens where the new spouse is going to come in and try to make peace and say, look, I'm not after the money, everything is cool, I mean, we're just two old people trying to get remarried and, move on with our life or whatever. People will try to do that, they'll try to be as non-threatening as possible, and I've seen that happen a few times. But if you want to make sure that the surviving spouse does the right things and gets a prenuptial agreement, because what will happen in that scenario that I was talking about before, many times, especially if the surviving spouse is the husband might be very, very nervous in getting a prenuptial agreement. They're just going to think that this is just a horrible thing to propose. It's just completely anti-social or anti-marriage or anti-peace or any of these types of things. They're just going to be very nervous about getting a prenuptial agreement. But if it's been mandated in the trust that unless you get a prenuptial agreement, there are going to be consequences, then you're protecting the children and you're protecting the family as well, because the children are not going to feel as threatened about an older person getting married. remarry. They're not going to feel as threatened about a new wife or a new husband or any of those sorts of things. And there's going to be more peace within the family. So that's why I think mandating a prenuptial agreement is often a good idea. There's this concept about the daughters getting less than what the sons get. And I want to be able to address that as well here, because that is sometimes a concern for many people. And it's a concern because there's this notion that equality is the same as equity, right? That this idea that it should be equal for it to be fair. In Islam, the men in the family, the boys, have a financial obligation that women just don't have. And that financial obligation is in the event that women in the family, the sisters, any of the women in the family, need assistance. If they need to be supported, it is the obligation of the men to do that. And classically, that obligation in Islam would be enforceable by a qadi. So you can actually, so if say one sister who doesn't have parents needs support, and the brother is just not providing that support, she can make that be enforceable. She can go to a qadi and she can say, look, it's his responsibility to take care of me. He's not taking care of me, and so he needs to pay up. Now, there isn't any similar right of support. So if the brother is impoverished and the sister is rich, he can't go to a judge and say, look, my sister needs to support me. There's no similar legal obligation. Now, we live here in the United States. There's no such thing as a sister going to a court asking for a brother to support her, right? There is no legal obligation for an adult sister to go to an adult brother or take an adult brother to a qadi and say that he needs to support me. That just doesn't exist. And so some people might say that because that doesn't exist, maybe the obligation shouldn't be the same. Maybe men and women should get something equally, right? And while there's no legally enforceable obligation, there is, in fact, an obligation. The men continue to have this obligation. But for parents who want it to be a legally enforceable obligation, they can actually do that in a trust. So you can design a trust to state that you can create a trustee. A trustee is a person who manages the property. And you can mandate that the trustee have the son sign a contract. And the contract would state that in exchange for you getting your inheritance, you are going to agree to support your sisters in the event that they require support, right? So you could mandate that and have that as a contractual obligation. Now, if the son decides to not sign that agreement, then you can just tell the trustee that the son is a permissible beneficiary as well as the sister. So if the son is not fulfilling his obligations, then you would fulfill his obligations on his behalf. This is, of course, a possibility. You don't have to get this detailed in your trust if you don't want to, but it is an option for you. What you are doing when you create this system for your family is you're creating an Islamic system of law for your family that goes just beyond the shares of inheritance. Because the shares of inheritance, of course, are mandated in the Quran, but they also have an overall framework and logic that go behind that, and you can also incorporate a lot of that framework within your trust as well. You could protect your children in other ways as well. If there are circumstances where there are children who have substance abuse problems or who have special needs, you could incorporate your trust to protect them from their own inheritance and from their own bad actions. In general, you cannot put strings attached to inheritance. You can't say things like, well, I want you to memorize the Quran or 5 surahs or something like that before you get any inheritance. You can't do that. You can't do things like you need to be married by the age of 35 or you're cut off. But people do these types of things. Or you need to earn over $100,000 or I'm not giving you anything. This is actually this is something that does happen in American estate plans. So you're not allowed to do things like that. Inheritance is a right, but we also do recognize that sometimes it's necessary to protect people. Many times, especially people who have a living trust, will find that they need to protect children because giving their children inheritance will stop any public benefits that a child with special needs is getting. Right, that happens on a fairly regular basis, and you want to protect that, and you want to be able to create a special system of rules and a special trustee to deal just with that. I'm going to also address the issue of wills. How am I doing with time? Does anybody know? Oh, 8:40. It's right up there. Okay. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to talk a little bit about a wasiyah. A wasiyah is your ability to give however much you want from within 1/3, I shouldn't say it's not however much you want. You can give up to 1/3 to whomever it is that you want with a few caveats. You cannot give it to people who already are entitled to inheritance under the Islamic rules of inheritance. One common place to give this wasiyah is, say, a charity. So if you wanted to give a masjid, a school, some sort of an institution, part of your wasiyah, you have the ability to do that. Inheritance going to your family members is vitally important. We used to have this system in Europe where the Catholic Church became incredibly powerful by virtue of a tactic that they used where they would go to somebody's deathbed, they'd go to a rich person's deathbed, and they'd say, "We will grant you absolution if you give everything, all of your money, all of your possessions to the Catholic Church," right? And of course, somebody who's on their deathbed, people on their deathbed make wacky decisions a lot of the times. And yeah, of course, children, they can fend for themselves. I'm in for this absolution deal. It's vital that you not do that. And I've seen it happen before with people within the Muslim community as well. I once had a guy who wanted to give all of his wealth. It was like $17 million. He wanted to give it all to the masjid after he died. And I was like, you have children, you have all of these family members, they're entitled to inheritance. You're not allowed to do that in Islam. And he was like, look, I haven't spoken to my children in over 20 years. They have their own children, my grandchildren. I've never met them. I've worked really, really hard for my money. Thank God in America we don't have to do Islamic inheritance. And of course, yeah, he doesn't. But of course, I have this policy that if somebody wants to do something haram, like manifestly haram, and in this particular case, it's giving everything to a masjid, I can't do that for him. A wasiyah is not the same as a last will and testament. A last will and testament in California is a document that goes through probate. It's a document that you state that you want to have all of the assets that are probate assets flow through the court. Not all assets are probate assets. So if you have assets in joint tenancy, in a living trust, if you have assets that are in a bank account that are beneficiary designated, your 401ks, IRAs, those sorts of things, those are typically not going to go through a last will and testament. In a wasiyah, you have the ability to give up to 1/3, except for the people who have the right to inheritance. Many people will also give a wasiyah to family members who are more distant. You have also non-Muslim family members. Non-Muslims do not have the right to inheritance in Islam. So all of those shares of inheritance, some people are married to non-Muslims. The non-Muslim wife, for example, does not have a right to inheritance but can benefit from a wasiyah. Many people have non-Muslim parents, for example. They want to give our brothers and sisters, parents, these types of people, they want to give some of their estate and they have the ability to do it through a wasiyah. They cannot, however, do it through the right of inheritance. Another topic I want to cover before we close out, and then I can take a few questions because it looks like we will have a few minutes, is guardianship. If you don't decide who is the guardian for your minor child, do you know who would decide for you? Courts, yes, of course. You need to be able to, if there's one thing that you do, and you can just email me if you want a guardianship form, I'll just send it to you. And I also have like a last will and testament form for people who don't want a lawyer, and of course, like I said, it's a relatively expensive way to go, and it doesn't work for many families. But I can send you that as well. Just let me know, and I'll send it to you. But there's also a one-page guardianship form that I can send you as well. If you nominate a guardian is appointed by a court. So you actually don't have the ability to appoint a guardian, but you can nominate who it is that you want as a guardian for your minor child in the event that you cannot do it. In the event that you cannot raise your child yourself. A guardian is, of course, not the person who adopts your child. The guardian will be the legal guardian, and you will continue to be the parent of the child, even if you're no longer there. Many issues that come up with guardianship that I've found have to do with the fact that a lot of Muslim parents don't know who to name as guardians or as for their minor children. They might not have very close family members here in the United States. They might not have very close family members at all, and they just need to find somebody who can do that. If it's the case where it's international, one thing that I suggest for guardianship is naming people that are local, like if you have friends that could take care of the kids at least until people from overseas can come here. You can name people overseas, so if somebody has brothers and sisters in Pakistan or Kuwait or UK or whatever the case may be, they could name those individuals and state that until the time comes that they can come here, you're going to have some temporary people who are going to act as guardians. That's actually fine. You can do that, and also continually search for who the most appropriate guardians might be. This changes over time. People look at their documents from 5 years ago, and especially if they're naming friends or even family members, they might find that a person they thought that was appropriate for raising their kids are totally inappropriate 5 years later. So definitely look out for changes that are always going to happen in your life. Changes are going to happen in the law, and you'll want to make sure and be as on top of that as possible. I talked about a bunch of different things during this talk. There were no questions yet. If there are any, or if there's things that I said that were not clear or anything like that. By the way, was this beneficial so far? Was this right? Are there things that maybe I should have talked about that I didn't talk about, or are there any questions about anything that I did talk about? Yes, brother. So I do things based on living trusts, and living trusts. Living trusts have no judicial supervision. So the whole idea, or one of the major ideas behind doing it in a living trust, is that it avoids probate, and administration is done outside of the purview of judges. Now, the only situation where a judge will pass on a living trust is if there is some sort of litigation, meaning one party is upset about what's in the living trust and wants to litigate the substance of it. And the reasons why you might be able to litigate what we call testamentary intent is that you would is either that the person was incompetent to make those decisions, or because there was fraud, duress, menace, undue influence basically elder abuse, types of causes of action. Nobody can actually come in and say, I'm getting half the inheritance of my brother, and that's unfair, judge, do something. You have free alienation of property, and you have what's referred to as testamentary freedom. If you don't want to give anything to your daughter, if you want to give everything to your son, you want to give everything to your daughter, you don't want your kids to get anything, you have full testamentary freedom to do that. I go to probate court. When I go to probate court, I have always gone to probate court on other people's living trusts and not my own. And my own living trusts have never been challenged or litigated in any way. So it's not like a judge has ever passed on them. And I've done many hundreds over the past dozen years, and I've never had a problem. There's a question in the front here. Oh, okay. Very good. Was there somebody from the sisters? Yes. So, because you're the creator of your own living trust, you are able to change whatever it is that you want whenever you want to change it. So we typically do it one of two ways. We either do an amendment, where say for example, you have a successor trustee, and you don't want you name your sister as a successor trustee, but then you have an argument with your sister and you don't want to be your successor trustee anymore. You just name somebody else. You can just do that as a one-page amendment and say that on section 4.1 change this name to this name, and and you can do that. The other thing you can do is a total restatement. You can just state that you can just all the substantive terms of the trust have been changed, but the name stays the same. And so then you just trash one version and then you get another version. A revocable living trust can be torn up, it can be restated, it can be amended. You can do whatever it is that you want to it. Once somebody dies or becomes incapacitated, the revocable living trust becomes irrevocable. You can't change it anymore. What we do sometimes is, not sometimes, I want to make sure that there are provisions that can be changed. And one scenario that is important to me is, well, what if somebody goes through, what if somebody has a death in the family, like somebody, like a parent dies or something, and then they die a few days later, and they didn't have a chance to modify the shares of inheritance. A judge is not going to interpret Sharia. A judge is not going to decide how shares are supposed to be distributed, and so we need to have some mechanism of changing that. And for that, and we need to have a mechanism of changing that after the trust has become irrevocable. And for that, we have something called a trust protector. And a trust protector is somebody who has the ability to make certain modifications. Typically, they're going to be administrative changes to the trust. There might be tax rules that might have changed or things that might have occurred, and there might be a reason for the ease of administration to change it. But in the way I designed them as well, I want to make sure that there is a way to change it even after death, so that inheritance is done correctly under the Islamic rules of inheritance, even if circumstances have changed. I will say, though, that if circumstances have changed and people have the ability to change it, they should do so as quickly as possible. I totally recognize that that people don't immediately lickety-split, call their attorney and say, hey, change this, change that. I had this period of time, I had this period in my life like 5 years ago where within a 2-week period, my mom passed away and I had a son that was born, and I didn't change my living trust for like 2 years, even though I can just do it on my own really easily. It's just a very hard thing to do for people. And so I do recognize that, and I want to make sure that plans should be adaptable that way. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so because it's privately administered, typically what will happen is that when somebody creates an estate plan, they are going to they're going to let people within their circle, their close family, and especially people who are named as their successor trustees, they're going to let them know that, look, if something's going to happen to me, I totally expect you to spring into action, right? If you named, if you have minor kids, and there's a sister that you have that you trust very much, you're going to tell your sister, look, I made this estate plan, you're going to be the guardians for these kids, and I want you to step up and take care of everything. You're named as the trustee with the person who's going to have the authority in the event that something were to happen to us. A trust is a relationship more than it is a document, right? And a trust is only as good as the people that you trust. And so it's not like the lawyer's going to automatically do something, or there's some sort of registry that's going to automatically come into play. You're going to have somebody who you trust. They're going to maybe get some help. Maybe they'll get a lawyer. Maybe they'll get help from like a professional fiduciary or something like that. But they're going to get some help, and they're going to say, okay, this is, I have a copy of the trust. Here's a copy of the last will and testament. We need to figure out. We need to gather the estate. We need to pay off any debts. There's a wasiya. I need to pay the wasiya. There are these kids. I need to make sure that they're taken care of. You need to actually line all of these stuff up and make a checklist and just do it, right? Yes, sister. So when I do estate plans, it normally includes several different documents. The main thing to do is it's less what the documents are than how you're benefiting your family and what you're specifically doing. It will typically include a living trust and wills. So normally do a living trust, and the will is what's referred to as a pour-over will. So if a living trust has assets in it. So if you have a home, like the deed to the home is going to be in the living trust. You might have bank accounts, other assets. Now, sometimes people forget to fund their trust, or they take assets outside of the living trust, and then it becomes a probate asset. If that happens, then the last will and testament is basically a cleanup document, and the only beneficiary of the last will and testament is the revocable living trust. So it goes from last will and testament to revocable living trust, and all of the substantive provisions of what happens after death or what happens during incapacity are going to be in the living trust. The living trust is a private document. The last will and testament is a public document. It's available for inspection, and you lodge it with the court. Even if there's no probate, you lodge it with the court, and anybody can go and see and read your last will and testament. So it's going to be pretty Spartan. One thing that's going to be in the last will and testament as well is going to be guardianship. So guardianship for minor children is typically an item that we put in the last will and testament. Other documents include a property agreement. So for married couples, we typically have a property agreement where a husband and wife agree what property belongs to whom. So if there's community property, even if it's community property, we kind of change the manner in which community property is owned, which California law allows you to do, into something that we call item theory, where there's this ability that the surviving spouse has to decide what property, if the surviving spouse is the wife, you create a spreadsheet and you divide up this is the wife's property and this is the husband's property, and it's about the same, right? So you need to be able to have the ability to do that. We also include a personal property memorandum as well. Personal property can sometimes be a really big issue. And that's something that people will often do on their own, though. What I mean by personal property is anything that you can pick up and take with you, or tangible personal property, like jewelry, things like that. Sometimes these things can be a cause of problems within families. It could actually cause disputes among siblings and people in, like daughters-in-law, brothers-in-law, people like that. It could be an issue. So it might be worthwhile to write these things down. We also have some rules that go to inheritance and wasiya within the living trust. So if somebody were to say give a daughter a necklace, and then there was and then it turned out that this was appraised by the trustee, and the trustee said this necklace is amazing. It's probably belongs in the Met, or it belongs in some really nice museum, and it's worth millions of dollars. It becomes unfair to give that necklace to that daughter, right? Because it becomes worth way more than what her share of inheritance is. So then that gift would have to fail. We're out of time? Okay. Brother Anwar has indicated that we are out of time. If you don't mind, please fill out the yellow sheet. Just keep in touch and just let me know how I did. I would really, really appreciate that, both brothers and sisters. If you didn't get a yellow sheet, get one from me and get a pen from me. Otherwise, I'm here. I can answer questions individually. Jazakallah khair. It's been an honor and privilege to come here and visit your beautiful masjid. Jazakallah khair, Brother Rushdie. Yeah.